the panel. Okay, now I'm set and I'm allowed to start. We're delighted that you're all here. I'd like to welcome you to this panel and discussion on academic publishing and reviewing, hosted by the International Cognitive Linguistics Association. Sherman is going to put the link in the chat so you can look it up. My name is Jennifer Hinnell. I am a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of British Columbia, and I am the Emerging Scholars Representative on the board of the International Cogling Association. I'd like to welcome all of you. It's nice to kind of be in the same cyberspace together, and I'd like to especially welcome our panelists and our 4 interpreters, and I'll introduce everyone in a moment. It appears that I may be frozen. I'll pause. Sorry, I think I left and I came back. It does appear there are still other people in the room, so I'll continue. Sherman, if this happens again, you can find my introductory notes in that document that you have access to, and you could jump in if you like. We're glad to, oh, I'm freezing again. I think maybe I'll just continue.
Jennifer, it doesn't look like you're freezing to me.
No? Okay. I will just move on then. Thank you. We are offering this event in ASL, BSL, and English. And so a few housekeeping notes, which everybody seems to have managed already. We'll have everyone except for the interpreters and the panelists who are speaking turn their camera off. This allows you all to hide non-video participants so that you only see the active panelist and the interpreters. If you need help on how to do that, please see the chat. Sherman is going to just drop a quick set of instructions in there if you need that. Live transcription is also enabled for this meeting, and to turn it on, you can see live transcript or CC at the bottom of your Zoom window, the Zoom controls at the bottom. And you can set this to see the transcript either as a subtitle or in a pop-out window. If you have technical questions, please send me a direct message in the chat anytime. I will answer it if I'm not speaking. And sending it directly to me rather than to everyone keeps the chat clear for other people to use the chat for conversation. Lastly, about the chat, please do use it if you'd like to, but it will only, but it won't be monitored for questions to the panelists until we start the Q&A, which will be in about 1 hour from now. So if you have questions for panelists in the question and answer period, please hold on to them, because Sherman and I'm sure won't be able to scroll to the top of the chat to find them. So we'll invite you to put your questions in the chat at the time that we start the Q&A. So if you're worried you'll forget them, go old school, get out a pen or something and just jot it down.
Jennifer, while you were frozen, a question came in that I'd like you to address right now. Okay. Can the recorded video be reviewed later?
Yes, we are hoping to post it at some point somewhere in, on the ICLA website. So look for information on these on social media, and I can also email the participant list here to share that once I know exactly where it's going to be posted. Okay. Although when we meet over Zoom, we are coming from all different lands and territories, I would like to start, as is the custom at Canadian universities and other institutions, by acknowledging the land that I live on. Because of COVID, although I'm a postdoc at the University of British Columbia, I am actually currently in Edmonton, Alberta, which is just east of the Rocky Mountains, and it is Treaty 6 territory, which is a traditional gathering place for diverse First Nation peoples, Métis and Inuit, whose histories and languages and cultures continue to influence and enrich our lives and our community here. If you'd like to find out more about First Nations whose land you may reside on, at least in Canada, you can look this up at native-land.ca. And I know that many other countries have similar resources. With all of that said, I am delighted to introduce our panelists today. And I will introduce them in speaking order. Dagmar and Bodo will start us off. Dagmar Divjak is a professorial research fellow in cognitive linguistics and language cognition at the University of Birmingham. She's also the editor-in-chief of Cognitive Linguistics, the journal. Bodo Winter is a senior lecturer in cognitive linguistics, also at the University of Birmingham, and a UKRI Future Leaders Fellow, and he is the editor-in-chief of Language and Cognition. Lina Hou is assistant professor in linguistics at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and a member of the editorial board of Cognitive Linguistics. And Jeannette Littlemore is a professor of English language and applied linguistics, also from Birmingham, and general editor at Language and Cognition, and associate editor at Metaphor and Symbol. So I am very delighted to have that amount of academic expertise and experience in our Zoom room today, and I'm looking forward to welcoming each of them as they come to speak, and thank you all panelists so much for making the time to participate today. I also would like to thank our interpreters, Mala Poe and Keisha Osborne, our ASL interpreters, and Christopher Tester and Christopher Stone, our BSL interpreters. Thank you all for making this happen, and also to Sherman Wilcox, chair of our board, for supporting me in putting this together. Just very briefly then, the format for the next 90 minutes, 80, is that we'll hear from Dagmar and Bodo on publishing in an academic journal for about the first 30 minutes. And then Lina will speak to us on access, also on publishing and the review process, particularly around access to publishing and barriers for minoritized scholars. And that'll be about 15 minutes. And Jeannette will close things out with a presentation on how to respond to reviewers or to reviews. So the review process, which is something I'm really looking forward to hearing more about as well. The last half hour or so will be a question and answer period where you all have an opportunity to ask questions directly to the panelists, and all panelists can contribute from their various experience and perspective. We'll do that Q&A through the chat, and Sherman and I will voice the questions, and we'll get to instructions at the time. So I'd like to remind the speakers to keep as closely as possible to your allotted time, since we're very keen to have plenty of time for the interactive portion. I think that yeah, that's kind of the emphasis for today, is to have an interactive event. And I think that's all for me. And so without further ado, I am going to open the event with by turning over the screen or the floor to Dagmar and Bodo. So bear with us as I make that happen. Excellent. Okay. So I will spotlight Dagmar and spotlight Bodo. Mute myself and stop my.
Perfect. I'm ready, Dagmar.
Okay, cool. So thank you, Jennifer, for putting this panel together and for inviting us to talk about how to publish in a top journal. And welcome everybody who's in this Zoom session to this session about getting published. So as Jennifer said, in the next half an hour or so, Bodo and I will talk you through the do's and don'ts of publishing in leading journals in usage-based linguistics. And as always in publishing, it's important to acknowledge your sources. So before starting, we'd like to thank Laura Yanda, whose slide deck on publishing in the journal Cognitive Linguistics lies at the origins of this presentation. We're particularly grateful to her for her motto, NGU, and you will find out later what that means. So the journals Bodo and I lead are respectively Cognitive Linguistics and Language and Cognition. So Cognitive Linguistics is the official journal of the International Cognitive Linguistics Association, and it's published by De Gruyter. Language and Cognition is the journal of the UK branch of the International Cognitive Linguistics Association, and it's published by Cambridge University Press. I would say that very roughly speaking, the remit of both journals is broadly similar, except that Cognitive Linguistics is slightly narrower than Language and Cognition. As it says, on the tin, Cognitive Linguistics focuses on work within the usage-based tradition with an emphasis on cognitive linguistic work, whereas Language and Cognition will go into the cognitive sciences more generally. But other than that, the journals work by and large in a similar way. So on this slide, I've put a makeup of the editorial team of the journal Cognitive Linguistics. And as you can see, I'm only the tip of the iceberg. So I'm supported by a whole team of colleagues, and my right hand is Dasha Hanslikova, who handles the day-to-day running of the journal. And she's a linguist, and she's also an expert in open science. And I'm also assisted by 6 what we call associate editors, who each deal with submissions in their area of expertise. So Zoltan, for example, handles metaphor and metonymy. Sherman, who's also on the panel today, handles gesture and sign submissions. Martin deals with historical linguistics and construction grammar. Benedict handles variationist submissions, and Karen leads on language learning. And in addition to these associate editors, I also have 2 consulting editors on the team. These are John Newman, who is the former editor-in-chief. He's my consulting editor for theory, and Peter Millen is my consulting editor for methods. And these 2 colleagues provide me with advice when things get tricky. And then last but not least, we have 27 editorial board members. We always have 1 editorial board member among the reviewers, and roughly speaking, it's their task to judge whether the manuscript that has been submitted to the journal falls within the remit of the journal. Now, as you can see, the editorial team of Language and Cognition looks very similar. So Bodo is editor-in-chief there, and Jeannette, who's also on the panel today, is one of the general editors. And funnily, we're all members of the same department at the University of Birmingham, so you can imagine that that's quite a usage-based nest where we live.
Okay.
Yeah.
Shall we switch?
Okay.
Perfect. So thanks, Dagmar, for this introduction. And I'm now going to talk about the early stages of the publication process before you even submit your manuscript and as you submit it. And then I'm going to hand back to Dagmar, who will talk about the stages once a decision is being made at the journal, and we'll talk about the decision process. So first of all, when Dagmar and I compiled these slides, one of the things that we wanted to highlight is that even before you submit your journal or your paper to any of these journals, or any other journal for that matter, it's a really good idea to get peer review feedback. Generally, any work is better when there's multiple brains who have worked on it. If you get extensive feedback from colleagues, from friends, or from members at a conference, then this will also facilitate the review process and will make it more likely that your paper is of the sufficient standard for one of those journals. So let's say that you've done this, then one of the things that you want to do is decide about which journal to submit. And that's a really important decision. One really important aspect of this is that you should never submit the same manuscript to more than to more than one journal. So it's really important that you're only submitting to just one journal. It's quite dangerous if this comes about and people realize this. This is really bad for reputation because it's actually requiring a lot of work from the reviewers and editors. And if you're asking multiple journals to do that at the same time, that's not a nice thing to do. And so you have to decide on the right journal. You have to think about, as you're writing your manuscript, which journal should this go to? And that's a really important decision, because a lot of papers actually get rejected, not necessarily because they're bad work, but because they may not actually fit with within the topic or the remit of the journal. And so you should consult the mission statement of the journal. Usually on the website, you'll find some sort of descriptions of the types of papers that the journal wants to see. Actually make sure that your paper fits with those mission statements. Another good thing to get an impression of whether your work would actually fit with the journal is to look at what's currently being published in the journal and what is the work that you are citing. So for example, if you're citing a lot of papers from cognitive linguistics, then that's a good sign that that may be within the general, like your topic fits within the general limits, remits of that journal. It's also a good idea to check the most recent issues and see what papers are being published, because that gives you a sort of impression of what's currently being debated. And then finally, you should also check whether actually the paper that you're writing is of a type of paper that fits with the journal. So whether this is actually an article category that's being supported. So for example, at Language and Cognition, we generally do not accept purely theoretical papers that don't have empirical data. And so that's something that's good to know, and that it will be specified on our website. And so make sure that actually the article, the type of article that you submit is actually allowed at the journal, and that will be specified on the website. It's very important that you actually, before submitting, read the author guidelines. Each journal has some sort of description about how to prepare your manuscript, what needs to be submitted. And it's at least my impression that people don't read these in enough detail. And they contain a lot of useful information. For example, things like the allowed word length. So if you're submitting a paper that's, let's say, 13,000 words, but the journal only requires or allows 10,000 words, then it would be unfair if they were allowing your paper to be reviewed, but other authors have to stay within their word limit. So it's very important that you check these things on the author guidelines. And then the author guidelines will also tell you what to submit. So different journals have different things that need to be submitted. All of them will require a manuscript. A lot of them will require a separate title page. Definitely a lot of journals like to have a cover letter, and it will be specified. The cover letter is your opportunity to describe your research to the editor and also describe why it would fit with the journal. The cover letter tends to be something that nobody really, it's a genre type that nobody tells you how to write. And so we have here a link of an example cover letter of a recently accepted paper, and I'll post that in the chat later. So just to give you an example of how this might look like. They're different for different projects, of course. And you'll have to suggest reviewers for most journals. Lina and others will talk later about this process as well. Okay, and then another thing, this depends on the journal, but both cognitive linguistics and language and cognition require some form of open data and open materials. So in our case, you would actually have to have the data on an openly accessible repository before you submit it to language and cognition. And that's also something that you need to check before you submit. All of that usually goes to a submission system. I personally find these submission systems quite annoying, but you have to upload all of these different manuscripts to them and then have to check that everything works. It's worth checking that it actually is rendered. Sometimes figures don't turn out right. So like make sure that everything is right once you submit it. And that's when it then goes to the people who are actually working at the journal. And this is where I hand over to Dagmar again.
Yeah, so then let me talk you through the publication process from the point of view of the journal, so to speak. And this whole process can be divided up into 3 phases. So once we've received the paper, the paper is on the system, the editorial assistant checks whether everything's there, everything's in place.
Dagmar?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, there was an error in the videos. Can you hold on 1 second?
Okay.
I apologize. I just need to re-spotlight us. I don't know what happened. I think we're ready. Okay, please.
Good to go? Okay, so once your manuscript is on the system, it comes first to the editorial assistant who checks that everything's in place, that you have the cover letter, you have an abstract, you have the manuscript is there, that your data statement is available, etc. And when all of that is fine, it ends up in my inbox, so to speak. And I have a first read through of the paper. And then I decide together with an associate editor whether the submission should go out for review. If we decide that it is good enough to go out for further review, we generally aim to get reviews from 3 colleagues, 1 editorial board member and 2 external reviewers. And in a third stage, then the reports by these 3 reviewers come back to the associate editor, who writes a summary report and makes a recommendation and forwards that to me, and I take all of that correspondence into account to make the final decision. Generally, we aim to turn things around within 3 months, but this depends to a large extent on the reviewers. How many reviewers we need to contact before we've got 3 who are willing to review the paper, whether they return the review within the agreed time frame, etc. So that's a little bit out of our hands. So let me give you a little bit more detail about each of these 3 stages. You have probably heard of the feared desk reject, which is when a paper gets rejected by the editor before sending it out for review. Now, it's often considered as something negative, but I actually don't think it is so negative. So as Bodo already mentioned, you have to check whether the remit of the journal you're submitting to whether your paper falls within the remit of the journal. And of course, not everything falls within our remit, and not everything meets our expectations. And to save the author time and effort, and to save our reviewers time and effort, we only send out papers that we think have a chance of making it through the review process. So if the submission doesn't fit the remit of the journal, and sometimes because it is really poor, it never leaves my desk. I reject it straight away. You will get an email saying why I don't think it's a good idea for you or for us to send it out for review. And this is of course disappointing when that happens, but on the other hand, you've also gained a lot of time. It would be much worse had I sent the paper out for review. You would have waited at least 3 months, sometimes 4, 5, 6 months to then get a reject. So in a sense, a desk reject also sets you free and makes it possible for you to move on with your paper and send it to a different journal where it fits better, for example. If the submission has merit and fits within what we typically publish in the journal, I will forward it to the relevant associate editor, who also reads it and who lets me know what they think about it. And if we both think that, or if at least one of us thinks that the paper stands a chance in the review process, we will send it out for review. If it goes out for review, we select 3 reviewers, 1 board member. And as I briefly mentioned before, it's the task of the board member to help us judge whether the paper that they're looking at is broadly of interest to our readership. And we also send it to other experts. Typically, we try to find 1 person who's an expert on the exact topic discussed in the paper, and then 1 other expert who specializes either in the language that's being analyzed in the paper or in the methods that are used in the paper. Now, finding reviewers is a bit of an art. And as Bodo mentioned, you are very often invited to suggest reviewers, and we sometimes use these suggestions, but not always. And sources that we use for reviewers are listed on this slide, and there's a whole lot of things we try. So we first look at the reviewers that you have suggested. We since we're all working within the field, we know quite a few colleagues who do similar research. So those are people we could try. We also check your references and see who is listed in your references, who seems to play an important role. Possibly we invite one of those people to review your manuscript. We're also quite keen to invite scholars to review your work who should have been listed in the references, but for some reason don't. If none of these routes give us the 3 reviewers that we need, we get very creative and we go and look around to see whether we can find information on websites for recent conferences, professional organizations, etc., who list people who have expertise in the field. We often get questions from people asking how they can start acting as reviewers for the journal. Well, one of the things is, like, we regularly do, let's say, a run to find new reviewers. We post a link to our form where you can sign up on our social media, and then we add the people who've signed up to our database of reviewers. The most important thing is that we can find you. So if you have a good website where you list some keywords, you will at some point show up in one of our searches. And then finally, which is the option I'm least keen on, those are the suggestions that are made by the system, the submission system, in our case, Scholar One. It does the strangest things. Now, when the paper has been out to those reviewers and they have read it, we typically ask them to return their review within 6 weeks. This is sometimes problematic, and it has been more problematic over the past year with the pandemic and the pressures that has put on everybody's time. But generally, we aim to round things up by about 3 months after initial submission. So at some point, the review reports become available. They go first back to the associate editor who reads them. All of our associate editors are very conscientious people. They read all of the reviews in much detail. They've also read the submission in much detail. And then they summarize the opinion of the reviewers and merge them with their own opinion. As you can imagine, reviewers very often disagree with each other. They have so many requirements that they would like to see you address in your revision, and the associate editor is, in a sense, the reasonable voice who will guide you through the many demands that the reviewers have. And then they write a report and send that to me. And then when I get to the point where I make a decision on the manuscript, I read through the reviews, I read through the summary and the recommendation from my associate editor, and then I write my decision letter based on that. Now, there are many decision categories that a paper can fall in, and I think they're broadly the same again across both journals. So I've briefly spoken about the desk reject. This is when a paper gets rejected, where basically it doesn't leave my desk or it doesn't get further than the desk of the associate editor. If the paper goes out for review, we have basically 4 categories. We have the category reject. So the 3 reviews come back, they're all rather negative. And the reviewers say, okay, there's too much work that needs to be done to this paper for it to be feasible, to be acceptable in the next round. That's reject. Then you have a resubmit. That's basically the verdict you get when the reviewers flag up important shortcomings, but they think you can address those shortcomings. However, they're not certain that the end result will be good enough. So that's a revise and resubmit. Then you have an accept subject to major revisions, which is when the reviewers say, okay, there are major shortcomings, but we're confident that the authors can resolve these. And then you have accept subject to minor revisions, which is very, very rare, which basically means you have submitted a wonderful paper and we only want you to insert, a few commas here and there and it'll be perfect. Now, reasons for rejection are typically one of 4. So for the journal Cognitive Linguistics, and I think for Language and Cognition as well, one of the main reasons is that the reviewers don't see how your paper makes a good connection with the journal's main concern. So very often there is a problem with either the theory, the theoretical embedding, or with your argumentation. Other problems that emerge are gaps in the literature review. So sometimes we get papers submitted that have by authors who have, for one reason or the other, missed an influential study, and the paper they are submitting is actually not as novel as they thought it would be. Or the literature review is, quite outdated. So it's 2020. We don't think that all the work is worthless, but we do think that influential papers have been published after 1980, for example. So make sure that your literature review is balanced, that you cite the most important older works, but also that you show that you know what's currently going on within your subdiscipline or your subfield. And then a last reason why papers are rejected is that there are problems with the data collection, with the statistics, or with the experimental methodology. And if that is the case, of course, it's very often possible to address those, but the outcome is uncertain. And in that case, many reviewers will say, okay, we don't, if you fix these problems, we don't know what the paper is going to look like. So we can't preliminarily accept it. Now, another thing you need to bear in mind when you receive reject is that rejections are very, very common. So if you look at this chart, this is the number of submissions per year since 2004. And you can see that it has been going up gradually for the past 15 years. So where we had about 50 submissions per year in 2004, we now receive about 150 new submissions every year. But the page count for our journal has remained the same. So we publish 4 issues per year, which each contain 5 to 6 articles. So we can basically publish 20 to 25 papers per year, but we receive 150, which means that we have to reject 125. When you look at this pie chart here, you see more or less what the frequency is of each of the categories that I briefly talked about. So just over 1/3 gets task rejected by me or an associate editor. Another 1/3 comes back from the associate editor as a reject, and then the remaining 1/3 approximately gets through pending revise and resubmit, major revisions or minor revisions. So yeah, you see, it's quite a battle, so to speak. Bodo.
Perfect, thank you. And so what I'm now going to talk about is what happens if you get the decision of having a revise and resubmit, or actually an accept with some form of revisions that you have to do. And we wanted to give you some advice and some sort of general recommendations for how to go through the revision process. I have to say, from a personal perspective, that I still, to this day, find getting reviews an emotionally harrowing experience. It depends. Sometimes it's really nice, but a lot of the times, just because you have submitted this work and you thought it was finished, then you get it back and you thought it was complete, and there's all of these issues that people find. It's very natural to have an initial feeling of negativity. What I like to do is set this aside and sort of not look at the revision, the recommendations maybe for a day. And then I get the confidence to look at them. But the advantage of that is to sort of resist the initial feeling of negativity. And I think it's really important that you actually think about the reviews as being generally written from the perspective that they want to help you improve the work. So one of the things that helps me is to have compassion with the reviewers and the editor, to think about the fact that they have put a lot of work into their judgment, and that actually makes me approach the review from a more positive perspective. And I think it's also important that you should take the reviews not necessarily as critique, although sometimes it can be a bit passive-aggressive and sometimes it can be a bit criticizing. But generally, you should take it as an opportunity to learn something about how to improve your work. When you're then dealing with the reviews, you need to read the reviews carefully. And so it's very important that you're not just doing some sort of like very superficial way of addressing the comments, where you maybe just add a reference, but you haven't really read the reference or incorporated the insight of that. So really engage with the feedback in a deep fashion and think about what it means for your study. Read all the suggested additional references and then implement the suggested changes. Now, once you've done this, or one important part of this revision process is that you write some form of revision letter, and most journals require this in some shape or form. I would recommend you to write one, even if it's not explicitly stated on the website. It's a good idea to have a revision letter. Actually, I personally write this before I even implement the changes. I write the revision letter because that helps me to be clear about what I want to do in implementing the changes. The revision letter, the audience of the revision letter is generally first and foremost the editor, but also the reviewers if the paper gets sent out for re-review. So sometimes the revisions are so complete that the editor decides not to send it out for re-review, but oftentimes it will be sent back to the reviewers. So it's a sort of dual audience of both the editor and the reviewer. And you want to detail in a point-by-point response how you responded to each of the comments made by the reviewers. And it's very important here to not miss anything. And as you are discussing your changes, I think it's important to make it easy for the editor and the reviewer to see what the changes are. So one thing that's maybe not so good, some people, they sometimes just say changed, and they don't really tell you what they have changed, what the new sentence looks like that was asked to be paraphrased. So it's a good idea to actually say, we changed this on page da-da-da, and here's the quote of the changed sentence, because then the editor or the reviewer can immediately see what your change was. And that can make a huge difference sometimes, because if your revision letter is very clear, and in some cases, then it might convince the editor to not send it out for re-review. And then you might have, you get a decision and accept within a few days, rather within the span of months of being sent back to the reviewers. Importantly, as you're dealing with the feedback, never be defensive, and also along the same lines, never miss an opportunity to say thank you. So it's generally nice to have something like, we thank the reviewer for this point. This is a very good suggestion, sort of like try to find common grounds with the reviewers. But nonetheless, you should stand your ground when necessary. And it's a sort of thin line between the two. Like, of course, the reviewers sometimes, some reviewers are fairly single-minded and may suggest things that you don't want to do. Ultimately, this is your work, and you have to make a decision about how far you want to go the reviewer's way. But if you stand your ground, of course, you have to do that in a diplomatic fashion. So think about, you could say things, for example, like, we decided not to address this point because it would blow the scope of the paper, which is already long, sort of give justifications for why you may not have implemented certain changes. So again, actually, the same document that I will post in the link has not only a cover letter example, but also a revision letter example, sort of showing you one way in which you could do this. Not to say that this is the only way, but this is one way in which you could write this document. Okay. And then I think Dagmar wanted to share Laura Yanda's motto.
Yes, so Laura Yanda's motto is NGU, never give up. Because one of the worst things you can do is give up on a paper. If you do that, it will never get published. So the best way is submit it. You will get some negative reviews. One of them will get rejected. Some of them will get accepted. But just keep at it. If you believe that your paper contains something of value for the community, just keep on trying to improve it, and try and see every opportunity, every review, even if it's a negative one, as an opportunity to learn and to get better at things.
Excellent.
Yeah, back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dagmar and Bodo, for all of that information. I feel like we've just had a fabulous walking tour through the publishing factory or something like that. And we'll continue with Lina's perspective now. So if I can invite Lina, we'll take 30 seconds to do the tech here. And if anyone has questions for Dagmar and Bodo, this is your 30 seconds to jot them down, and then so that you can ask them in the Q&A. All right, hang tight. Okay, it looks to me like we're good to go. I can see Lina and the two interpreters. Does that look good? Great, over to you, Lina. Thank you so much.
Yes. Oh, wait, hang on. Hi, and good morning from Santa Barbara, California. It's about 8:40 here in the morning. I'm a little bit awake, but I am here to talk about the hidden curriculum of publication. And what I mean by hidden curriculum is that a lot of things about the publication process for emerging scholars and junior scholars is things that we are unaware of, and we need to figure out how to do it, and we don't want to do it the hard way. And so what we should know tends not to be accessible. Sometimes minoritized emerging scholars are unaware, and we want to make sure that that information is there. So my short talk is based on my own experiences of publishing in linguistic journals, how emerging scholars can navigate the challenges of publishing and reviewing. And Dagmar and Bodo already covered some of the issues, which I may have some overlap. The first issue is where to publish the paper. That is, which journal will you submit your paper? In linguistics, there are many different journals to choose from, and they vary greatly. So linguistics can include different topics like cognitive linguistics, sociolinguistics, applied linguistics, etc. There is no similarity. We have cognitive sciences and others. And so a very broad view of linguistics is out there, and different journals have their own conceptualization of what constitutes linguistics. And so there's no, there's no universal definition. And usually they have an editorial note or a statement about their own aims and scope. The aims mean that the purpose of what the journal wants to accomplish, and the scope means that the topics of what they will publish. For example, cognitive linguistics, there's not a lot of mention of sign languages in some journals. It doesn't mean that they won't publish these articles, but journals tend not to mention specific languages because they want to encourage submissions on sign language, for example, because there's not enough publication on them. The journal that you might be interested in submitting to, if you look at the topics that have already been published in that journal, that will give you a better idea. So look at the volumes, the issues, particularly in most recent years, and that will give you a better idea of how your paper might fit into the journal. Sometimes different journals, you can see that they have an article about sign language, for example, especially recently. And sometimes there are articles that are quite old. And so I would try to avoid those because the recent ones give you a better idea of their interests currently. Research does evolve, and the editors change often as well. If you're still unsure about which journal is a good fit, I would recommend emailing the associate editor with just a short summary, maybe 100 words of your article or your paper about what you want to discuss, and ask them, do you think this would be a good fit in your journal? They'll probably give you a good idea. You'll have a good feel for if this is a good idea, rather than getting a desk reject right away. When you're done identifying the journal, I think, and if you think it's a good fit, then best communicate and submit the paper. You may, as mentioned, what you want to include a cover letter, as Dagmar and Bodo mentioned, when submitting your paper. You can propose a list of suggested names, which is really important. I think at least 3 names. Think about who is the best person to look at reviewing your paper, who can provide good critical feedback. If you're in a small field like sign language research, or if you work from a very specific theoretical view or framework that isn't commonly known, you can talk about the names of the people you are proposing and why. Put the names in, their affiliation, like the university of the people where they work, a brief explanation of why you think those proposed names would be good. Many linguists who are not in my field might not know who the researchers are that I mentioned, or the politics of the research. And so I like to think of giving names to help the editors make more informed decisions, who to ask to review the paper. When you submit the names, you need to think about a conflict of interest or potential. You cannot put down the names of, per se, the people who you are currently working with, who you're writing the paper with, people who are in your department, either your previous MA or your doctoral committee members or anyone like that that you have affiliations with. If you submit the paper and you get the review back, I encourage you to think about the comments as a conversation. Maybe like a sit down with 3 people who are discussing your work. Try to envision, again, a conversation like Dagmar mentioned and Bodo said. The reviewers' intentions are for you to be successful. Most of the time, they want you to improve your paper. And yet sometimes it's not a good fit. It might be off the topic or out of the scope of the journal. And so any changes that the reviewer suggests that you don't agree with, as they said, you can say why you don't want to do this or why you're not doing it. You need to explain your view and explain it well. It's important to be strategic, to provide information for the editor and the reviewers to see your point of view. A more general example would be, I work on American Sign Language, ASL. There's no public corpus of ASL. And so I'm limited in a specific type of analysis, particularly with quantitative analysis. I cannot run huge statistical analysis of specific grammatical constructions in ASL. It's just impossible. So if a reviewer asks me, you know, you need more data and you need to code and run more tests, then I really can't, because coding and analyzing ASL data is labor intensive. It is really tough. And I need to tell them that because they may not know. So I need to say that coding and notating certain things are very difficult, and perhaps offer a compromise where maybe I can do a little bit more of something else. So again, it will depend on the research questions that you are attempting to answer. The point is that it's important to emphasize in linguistics, the field has various amounts of data on different languages. that are accessible or not. And so data for sign language, again, no corpus for ASL. Languages that are under-described or having low resources are very difficult, and the reviewers might not be aware of that. And so it's important to educate them if you are able to, particularly about the variations that exist. And one more thing, reviewing papers. If you find yourself, like I did, in a situation where someone says, do you mind reviewing this paper, and you don't know what to do, let me offer a few tips. My understanding is that maybe many young emerging scholars have never reviewed papers. Or maybe while they were in graduate school, someone asked them to look at one, or they've practiced with their PhD advisor to review papers. That's possible, but I never had that experience in grad school at all. And so one thing that I was surprised to learn was that I was asked to review a paper, and it's been commonly happening that the field is very broad, and there's, I say broadly because most papers I reviewed are not about sign language, but they're presented in a framework of cognitive functional linguistics. And so most papers that I reviewed, again, not about sign language, but they're still within cognitive functional linguistics. And so I think that it's important that I continue to review those papers. So looking at language analysis, I should be able to, and I do, understand the kind of theory. I understand the theoretical argument that they're bringing forth. And when I look at the review, if it's a specific topic, I may not know it, but I do understand the broad view. So when reviewing a paper, think about the positive feedback. Say what you like about the paper, what you find exciting about the paper, what kind of contributions you see this making to the field. Be positive, and then offer some critique, not big time critique, but some feedback. The critique is based on your decision. If you're going to recommend the paper or reject the paper, so you need to be cognizant of how you provide that feedback. So if it's revise and resubmit, or if it's an accept with minor revisions, et cetera, you need to be aware of how you give that feedback. And so maybe you'll read the paper and then write the feedback before making a decision. Some people read it and give feedback at the same time. I think it's best to read the paper in its entirety, think about it, read it again, and then decide if it should be accepted or rejected, accepted with revision, et cetera, and that will allow you to be more clear about the kind of feedback that you're going to give. One nice thing about reviewing papers for cognitive linguistics, if I review a paper and I submit comments, the associate or editor-in-chief will make a decision about the paper to accept or reject, ultimately. And I can see their decision, plus I can see other reviewers' comments and compare. So I can see what my comments look like if they overlap with other people. That helps me review my papers in the future. And I was surprised to learn that people who are more experienced in reviewing, particularly senior scholars, they are more apt to reject than junior scholars. Most of the time, I think. They would say, oh, you need to revise and resubmit. But senior scholars say, no, reject. I just learned this. And I think the reason is because of experience. You need to review a lot of papers. You need to build your intuitive knowledge if a paper is a good fit for a journal or not. And that takes time and experience. I think I'll turn it over to Jeannette, I believe you are next to talk about the next item. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Lina, for those very practical strategies on both publishing and reviewing.
I'm sorry, I need to figure out how to stop sharing. Oh, you helped me. Okay, thank you.
Great. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much, Lina. Jeannette, we'll turn it over to you to finish the tour. Just give me 10 seconds here to switch out the spotlight, and also for our participants to write down their questions for Lina to hang on to them.
Hi, thank you very much. And I'm sorry that I'm replacing Lina's lovely looking cat there, which I was enjoying looking at on the screen. Yeah, so Lina's introduced a lot of the main issues to do with when you're asked to write a review, and this is what I've been asked to talk about a bit, is when you are writing a review for a journal, what kind of things we as associate or general editors are looking for in a review. And I'd just like to build on what Lina talked about there. The first thing I would say is, the first consideration is, does this make a significant contribution to the literature? Is there something new? But being new isn't enough, because there's a lot of stuff that hasn't been found out that we don't necessarily need to know. But is it new and it's saying something that we need to know, that's going to build our knowledge in the area of cognitive linguistics or metaphor studies? There's kind of links into previous stuff, but kind of takes us forward in a significant and meaningful way. And if you've got some questions on that later on, I'm happy to answer them in a more specific way. So basically, prioritize content over form. So look more at what it is they're saying rather than how it is they're saying it. So when you do talk about the way in which it's written, maybe save that for the end, but focus specifically on the content first and foremost. And then going through the article, as you read through it and as you review it, starting with the literature review, the first thing I suppose is to look at whether the literature review is up to date, but most importantly, whether it justifies the research questions. So whether the research questions come naturally or evolve naturally from the literature review, and whether they're closely related, whether they are justified by the literature. And so you're looking really at, is the literature review biased, or does it contain a balanced selection of relevant literature? Is there literature that they needed to cite but which they haven't cited? And if so, can you provide enough information about that literature so that they know where to go in order to find it? On the subject of the research questions, it's important that they do come naturally out of the literature review, but it's even more important than that they are actually answered in the paper. And this does occur from time to time, that people don't actually answer their research questions, or they answer some of the questions, but not all of them. So that's a thing to check and to comment on in the review. Is the methodology that's employed appropriate, and have they explained why they've chosen this particular methodology? So is there a good justification for this particular choice? And when they're writing the methodology, have they employed appropriate statistics? And is there enough information about the statistical methods to allow you to evaluate whether they have been done correctly or not? So for example, is there information on an online repository with details of the data collected and the statistical tests that have been run, and the coding that was used, the code that was used to run them? That's quite important. So that that makes the studies more replicable. The next thing is, are the conclusions that are drawn from these results valid? Do they make sense? And then again, do they relate back to the research questions in a satisfactory way? So I think once you've covered all of these things, then I would ask to focus a little bit on the style and the presentation and the language in the article. Just a couple of things to finish off. I think it was Bodo was talking about how, as a writer, you need to write a response to a review. And so, as a reviewer, what the onus on you really is to write the review in a way that facilitates a response. So write the review in a kind of orderly and systematic way so that there are clear points that a writer can respond to in a logical and systematic way. So try to separate the different issues and speak to each of them separately. The second thing is in the current climate with the COVID crisis, we at Language and Cognition and at Metaphor and Symbol are happy to give you slightly longer to do the review if you feel that you cannot do it in the time frame that's originally suggested. And I think there's an understanding in the field now that people are under a lot of pressure, and so people are not expecting reviews to come through quite as quickly as they might otherwise be. And we are making that clear to the authors. And I think the final thing that I would say is be kind. So remember that these reviews do go to the authors. They get to see the authors. So remember there's a living, breathing person at the end of this review. And so, yes, you may need to find problems with their work and areas that need to be improved, but they can be couched in supportive and helpful ways rather than in ways which are simply too critical. And I think that's all I have to say about how to write the review letter.
Thanks very much, Jeannette. That's very helpful. One of our health officers through COVID said, be kind, be safe. And I feel like the whole academic community should be here today to hear this about the publishing process. Have compassion for the authors, have compassion for the reviewers and the editors.
Absolutely.
So yeah, thanks very much for all of that insight. Jeannette, if you can stay spotlighted, that's okay. I'll ask our other panelists to turn their cameras on now, and then I will spotlight you as well. Okay, it looks like we have, to me, it looks like we have 4 panelists, myself and 2 interpreters. Now, I will be speaking to voice the questions. Should I keep my camera on? Can I ask the interpreters?
Sure.
Sounds like it? Okay, great. I will do that. Sherman, would you like to turn your camera on, because you will also be helping me monitor the chat and speak the questions. Thank you. I'll add a spotlight. I think we're still under our maximum. Okay. Excellent. Well, let me start by, at this point, just thanking our panelists all for that really a tour de force through the academic publishing pipeline, really, from individual researcher, and you each spoke to different parts of the process. You know, I think if this was a required short seminar for every incoming graduate student, it would be a great start to the post-secondary publishing process. And I think it was Lina who said also to reviewing. I find myself in the same boat, being asked for reviews now. As soon as you are a doctor, they're like, oh, a new doctor, we haven't asked this person yet. And they send you things. And reviewing, same with Lina's experience, I have found is not something that you are required or really coached through in grad school. And unless you're very lucky and have a research methods course where that's part of the kind of curriculum there. And so it's, you know, I always send a review and then want critique on my review. So anyways, I hope that, yes, so thank you all. Thank you also for the interpreters who are working very hard here. And we are going to turn to the chat where Sherman and I will look for questions, especially just keep putting them in there, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. And I'd really like this just to be a kind of open season panelists. So if you have something that you want to jump in with, then just unmute yourself. The worst case scenario is 2 people start at once and we can all handle that. So just unmute yourself rather than bothering too much with raising hands and all that kind of thing. Okay, let's see. I will choose the first one, and Sherman, if you can be surfing here for the next question. I'll start with one just off the bat because it picks up on Jeannette's last point about style and language. Someone's asking here, is it crucial to have proofreading to make the writing native-like? I'm assuming here because these are international journals, there are a lot of papers that are manuscripts that are submitted by non-native speakers so I imagine that's where the question's coming from. So I will mute myself and just ask you all to jump in.
Yep. I would say that definitely ensure that the paper is well written, is clearly written. And if you feel that you need a proofreader to do that, then good. I would query the term native-like, because there's all sorts of political issues there to do with the native speaker norm. I think a good, advanced, experienced user of English is what you're aiming at. The ideas need to be clear and written in a way that is accessible and understandable to all. So that's what I would say on that. Clarity.
Bodo, do you have something to add?
One thing I would add to this is that obviously the journals will primarily look at the content, as has been said many times. However, it's still going to, you're going to put yourself at a disadvantage if the writing is very difficult to understand. Because reviewers generally have a sort of more negative attitude towards texts that they find really hard to understand. So I think it's definitely in your advantage to make sure that the writing is at least intelligible. That's the main thing that is going to be very important.
It's been asked again if the recorded video will be made available online, and Jennifer, you said that will be posted on the Cognitive Linguistics website, or the link to it?
Yes, I haven't quite sorted out who's hosting it and where, but we will send it out via all the channels that we sent out this event invitation. So on social media, on the ICLA newsletter, perhaps next time. So there'll be a little bit of delay. I'd like to check the live transcription and that kind of thing, but you can certainly expect to see the recording in cyberspace at some point in the summer. Somebody said, yes, I'd like to watch it 365 days a year. So clearly there's some content here that's needed and resonating. We will have it up, and I'll share that when we have that. Thanks. Sherman, do you have another question that you?
Yeah, yes, a question for the editors-in-chief. Will you accept a sign language in a proposed article instead of writing in English? Will you accept a proposal for an article in sign language, not about sign language, actually in a British Sign Language or American Sign Language instead of written English?
That's a good question. That's would be without precedence. I don't know, Dagmar, whether you have experience with this.
Well, I would send it to Sherman for help with the with the assessment, so to speak. I think if the journal has sign language experts on board, I think that would not be a problem. If that is not the case, then we would have to look into how we can access the content of that proposal. So for cognitive linguistics, it's fine, as long as Sherman can help me out. But yeah, but it's a good question. It's something that that's not happened, and that had it happened, okay, I would have been okay. But otherwise, this is something we probably should look into, and we should have some procedure in place that we can activate once it happens, so that we're not surprised. And it takes ages to get back to you. So thank you for raising this.
Lina, do you have anything you'd like to add to that about your experience? Do you have experience sending in abstracts or to journals in the way that the person who asked the question is intending?
Yeah, well, I know it will depend on the journal. For example, Sign Language Studies, SLS, we just learned that they will not accept a paper in sign language because it is under Gallaudet University Press. And they have another journal that focuses primarily on signed papers. I don't remember the name, I apologize. And so they have another journal specifically for that purpose, those that are in sign language. So it's a little odd that Sign Language Studies would not have papers in sign, but only in English. And So I think for cognitive linguistics or other journals, it would be interesting to see what would happen. Again, it would depend on the publishing company and their policies regarding the languages. For abstracts, however, I have reviewed abstracts in sign language for conferences, which I think is fine. One challenge for me, however, is when I review the abstract in sign, I have to figure out how to evaluate it in a different way because it's a new experience for me. I'm used to reviewing abstracts and articles in English and reading them, but in sign, it's very different. I have to figure out how to respond to give feedback in certain ways and how to provide that feedback in a written form. Yeah, but I think it is important discussion to have, definitely.
Excellent, thank you. There's Lina, you've just been put on the spot, but there's actually one more question directly directed to you about conflict of interest. And obviously any other panelists also will have experience with this, I'm sure. The question is, can you please go back to the conflict of interest when you're suggesting reviewers, and is it always problematic, or in some cases, is it okay to include suggestions? Presumably I'm now inferring to include suggestions for people that maybe fall into some of the categories, Lina, that you mentioned in your talk.
Got it. Right. Let me bring this a little bit to a different view. So suppose you put down the name of your current advisor or former advisor to review the paper. And you think, why not? That's the best person that knows your work. On one hand, that's fine. But if you want the article to be published in a general audience to read, they might not have your background or your advisor's background, and therefore that person might not be the best person because they'll understand everything that you're writing, presumably. And so you want to see how other people outside of the field or who do not know you or work with you closely understand your work. And so that's a good way to think about the conflict of interest, a way of getting feedback from someone who is outside or who doesn't already know your work. So the people like the audience members who will be reading your work. I think that's the easiest way to think about it. And so that would be my answer. But if you're wondering about more specifics, to put down names that could be a conflict of interest, is there something else? If you could expand and let me know what you mean specifically.
Okay, we'll see if they add something to the chat about specific types of conflict.
Sure.
Dagmar, Bodo, or Jeannette, anything to add to the conflict of interest?
Maybe Dagmar, and then.
No, go ahead.
Did you have something to say?
No, I didn't.
Oh, okay. So yeah, one additional suggestion. So I think in a small field, it is sometimes unavoidable that some of the names, there will be some sort of overlap in terms of affiliations, or maybe you have collaborated with this person in the past. And it's actually okay in those circumstances to say, I would suggest this reviewer, and in my justification say, I have collaborated with them 10 years ago, but I think they would still be able to give a unbiased review. I think what's really important from the sort of journalist perspective, if I'm an editor, and I actually recently had a situation where somebody recommended 3 suggested reviewers, and they were all from the same institution of the author, that actually looks very suspicious, and it immediately raises some warning bells in the editor. So sort of think about how to navigate that space, but you can talk about justifications and make exceptions.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much. Sherman, do you have one on deck? Oh, hang on. I'm just going to unmute you.
Yes, a question about formatting. Many journals have specific requirements for formatting, such as a particular citation or placement of figures or tables in the manuscript. Do you all think that this is something to watch out for, or wait until later in the publishing process?
I think it's best to address this when you first submit the paper. Otherwise, it suggests it might be a paper that's done the rounds and been rejected by a number of journals, and you kind of like not formatting it. So I would want it to be formatted, I think, in the appropriate way.
I'm not so picky on that, as long as it's presented in a format that's easy for the readers. So I don't think that having all your figures and tables at the end is useful for the reviewers. So I mean, I don't mind which referencing system you use or how it's formatted, as long as it's easily digestible for the readers, because you don't want to put them off before they've gotten started. But I don't particularly mind about the exact way it's been formatted in, or which font you've used or anything like that. So that's where our journals differ, I guess.
I want to
just saying that you get things that are formatted in a way that is really awkward for linguistics. This does raise a bit of suspicion that, where has it been before?
Right. So use the norms in the field, because if you're in the field, you're indicating that you are, then that would be your kind of accustomed format. Dagmar, I want to ask, it's not in the chat, this is for me, but since I have the power, I'm just going to jump in with my own question about figures. In submitting manuscripts, some journals still have in their instructions to please put the figures either in a separate document or at the end, or any of these things, which I think are archaic in the sense that they are based on a print publishing process that is no longer current. Can you comment on whether people who are submitting should adhere to that because it's on the list of rules, or not, because it makes it very annoying and difficult when you're reviewing to have to find the figure that's not in the manuscript anywhere? So if you can give us all tips on that, I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, I think the best thing to do is to check the journal guidelines. I think we have removed every trace of this in our formatting guidelines. So we accept, papers that are generally within the linguistic subfield, so to speak. But some journals do ask that you apply their specific type of formatting from the very start. And in that case, I think it's you don't have a choice really. You can always try sending an email to the associate editor or to the editorial assistant asking, what the deal is, but they're very likely to come back to you and say, this is what we want. I know some journals use this as a triage tool. So only people who are serious enough to go through the formatting issues, we don't, but it's very journal specific. And I would recommend that you check the instructions for authors very carefully before you submit, because some journals also use this as a reason for desk reject. Again, we don't, but it exists, and you don't want to get desk reject just because you're formatting. But generally, I think for our journals, it's make it easy for the reviewers. Put the tables where they're supposed to be. Put the figures where you're describing them. It will make reading so much more enjoyable.
I agree with what you say about the make it easy credo. And actually, we have just updated our author guidelines this week. And actually in it now says that we prefer having the figures in situ to make it easier for the reviewers, at least for the first submission, because it's just easy to read the paper as a standalone product. So that's right now is our preference. We're not going to reject a paper that doesn't do it, but it's easier for the reviewer.
Great.
I have another question.
Great.
What makes a paper or study stand out to be published in a top journal? Is it something about the contribution that makes it a good theoretical development in the field, or is it using cutting edge materials and methods, or is it something else?
For cognitive linguistics, it's ideally all three of them. So you ask a question that's theoretically very relevant, you answer it using methods that are at least suited to the question, but ideally cutting edge in the field, and uses data that is adequate to address the question. So ideally, we want all three of them. If you can deliver on one of them, we want you to excel in one of the other two remaining areas. So for example, if you have a brilliant theoretical idea, but for example, you work in an area that's for which data is just not so easy to come by, like Lina just said about, sign language corpora, really difficult. You work on minority languages where there are very few speakers left, data is really difficult. That'd be brilliant in the theory and very convincing in your theoretical approach. If you're, the question always needs to be theoretically relevant, but you can highlight, one of those two other domains. I think Lina also said that I can do a little bit more of this, or I can do a little bit more of that, because this particular thing is very difficult for my area. But you also have to make a good argument for that. You have to describe in your paper, say, for example, I work on a very small language. There are only 73 speakers left. I've interviewed 17. This is a huge proportion of the population. Or I work on a language for which there aren't any corpora available. Make a very good case in your paper. One thing also to note in relation to this is that the letter to the editor only goes to the editor. So if there are things that you want the reviewers to know, that has to go in your paper. So these types of justifications, include them in your narrative.
And I agree with everything that you say, Dagmar. One thing I would add to this, so we, one of the things that we have done at Language and Cognition recently is to explicitly mention the fact that we would also consider null results and replication studies. So like, even if it's just exactly an existing study, to sort of encourage more open science practices and replications, as long as they are sufficiently still well-grounded in the literature, as long as they're rigorously conducted, all of these sorts of things that you say. So we don't necessarily expect pure novelty. That's not the only criterion that's used for accepting a paper.
Great, thanks for bringing up null studies. There was actually another question. I don't know if you're monitoring the chat as well. Yeah, about that. So someone just followed up about replication studies and to what extent. Maybe I can just invite you all to answer to what extent these are currently widely published in linguistics or a credible contribution to the field, and are they more or less likely to be published in comparison to new research with obviously positive results?
So maybe what I would say, I think probably at this stage, there are not that many replication studies, but there should be more. That's one of the reasons why we changed our author guidelines to explicitly mention that we consider replication studies to actually allow this to happen and to sort of like incentivize this. But yeah, I think, yeah, that's what I would say on this. Oh yeah, and actually maybe Dagmar, also worth mentioning is that we, both cognitive linguistics and language cognition now have registered reports. So that's a new article category where you will submit your paper without having conducted the study yet. The idea there is that then the paper will be reviewed based on the merits of the methods and whether it's theoretically motivated, before the results are known, so that it's a results blind review process. And it's not the case that something gets rejected maybe because somebody doesn't like the results or because they are null results. And that way then null results are more likely to get published.
A question about getting different feedback from reviewers on the same issue. One example would be that one reviewer finds the literature review very well written while another one heavily criticizes it, or one reviewer says that the language is very well written while another says it needs to be proofread, even though it maybe was already proofread by a native speaker prior to submission.
As an editor, we will give you guidance and a steer on that. So in the covering letter, there will be kind of, this is what we want you to focus on. This is perhaps a bit less important. So we won't just leave you in the lurch with two completely conflicting reviews and then for you to work out for yourself what to do about them.
But then sometimes actually, Jeannette, I think that's very laudable, isn't it? But then a lot of editors don't actually do that at other journals sometimes. And then the authors are sort of left hanging. And I think what I would say to that is that the revision letter is an opportunity for you to frame the reviews. So you can actually quote the reviewers and sort of say, this is what we took from this, and this is how we addressed it. So you can actually sort of summarize the reviews as well.
Yeah, as an associate editor, I do the same thing. I try to give some helpful hints about what to pay attention to and what maybe not.
Yeah, it can be a tricky letter to write because you know that sometimes the reviewers are also copied in or back copied. So yeah, careful. Yeah.
Thanks. There's one, I think we've got 5 minutes left, so that's probably time for this one and one last question. So Sherman, if you can look for one more, I'll ask this one. When submitting a manuscript, will it put authors an advantage if they attach samples of data, especially videos, this person mentions, and data analysis? And specifically with regards to sign language research, clearly, and gesture research, which is becoming an increasingly important part of this, of our field, that more and more people are using multimodal data. So I'm interested, I wonder, Lina, what I'd like to hear your experience when you're submitting your research, since of whether you've ever been invited to or just on your own done.
For my research, I always put a figure or a film still in the text. And for each example, I tend to do that. In addition to, recently, I have my own account on a digital repository. And that's where I can put the data. So you can put the data that you code, list the videos and the analysis there, which is really nice because it gives the reader and the reviewer access to the data that I am using. In addition to that, you can publish the article and what do you call that? The data set in a separate publication, which is really nice. And so that's kind of cool because in the future, people can cite your data set when they do some research on it. So you get credit for that as well. And so, yes, I think that putting down or including pictures or videos in the article and providing a data set link just to make sure that everything is accessible, it's functioning, it's working, et cetera, et cetera. It's a lot of work, but I think it's totally worth it, and getting credit for both is important too. Also, the type of digital repository. There's a lot online. Universities have them. There are some in public venues that you can use as well.
How about if I select 3 final questions, because I think they're fairly short answers. One of them is, do cognitive linguistics and language and cognition publish mainly quantitative studies? Another one is, could you offer some suggestions for submitting book reviews? And the final one is, does an author have to belong to some academic entity like a university or laboratory to get published? Or do you only consider the paper and its scientific value?
There are lots of questions here.
That was book reviews, institutional affiliation, and quantitative studies.
Yeah, so maybe I'll briefly say something on quantitative studies at Language and Cognition, because actually at Language and Cognition, we emphasize those, or at least studies that have empirical data. So it could also be a qualitative analysis, but it would have to involve real sort of corpus data or something like that. We wouldn't consider purely theoretical and review papers unless in the context of a special issue or something like that. And then for book reviews, I would just briefly say that for book reviews, we generally have a review editor. And in our author guidelines, it says that you can contact the review editor if you have an idea for what book you want to review. But they're actually often consulted. So the review editor gets the books sent from the publishers. And so then they will often reach out to people that they think are appropriate. But if you have an idea, it's definitely a good idea. And it's a good sort of way of, especially early on, to get some used to the writing and submission process to suggest a book review.
Yeah, it's largely the same with cognitive linguistics. Most of our papers are based on data. It can be qualitative analysis or quantitative analysis, but most of the papers are based on data. We do accept theoretical articles, but they have to be absolutely brilliant. So as I said, we want good quality across theory, methods, and description. So if you can't offer data, we want something more in one of the other baskets. We no longer publish book reviews. We ran out of space. So we have discontinued that genre, so to speak, but we were talking with the ICLA to see whether we could get some book reviews up on the website, but that's not materialized yet. That was pre-pandemic. And then the affiliation, no, affiliation is not at all important to us. The reviewers, I saw someone else ask that question. The reviewers don't know who you are. You don't know who the reviewers are unless they sign their reviews. So it's a double-blind review process, and nobody's aware of your identity or your affiliation.
Wonderful. I think on that note, and at exactly 10:30 in the morning east of the Rocky Mountains, and time for dinner for many of the rest of you, we'll wrap it up. I want to very heartfeltedly, I really want to thank the panelists for your time and commitment to sharing all of your expertise and knowledge with over 100 emerging scholars this morning. We really, really appreciate your presence here and your contributions. Thank you also especially to Mala, the lead interpreter at UCSB, for helping me to coordinate and also to find and put together this exceptional team of interpreters. Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. We really appreciated it. It was good to be with linguists from all around the world. And please do stay tuned, like I said, for the video recording, which I will get up at some point in the next few weeks. And we will send out a note. If you got the email with the link this morning, you will also get an email as to the video that I post, and then we'll share it on social media, etc. So you should be able to find it out there. I wish you all a good day if there's much day left, or a good evening, and hope to see you again sometime in person soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Jennifer and Sherman for organising it.
You're welcome. Pleasure.
Thank you, Jennifer.